This podcast is not intended to be a substitute for therapy. If you are experiencing mental distress, please seek professional help.
I fall asleep under the trees. I follow where the current leads. Whispers in the woods, they call to me. Listen as the wind awakes the leaves.
Welcome to the Wellness Project Podcast. I am your host, Wilson. Each episode aims to bring mental health awareness through exploring psychoeducation, scholarly literature, professional interviews, and the personal stories of people's journey to mental wellness. So, with that said, let's get started.
I can feel the mountains come alive. It feels like my whole life I've been blind.
Sort of as we're talking about the 5 stages of grief, there are also different symptoms that you might experience when going through grief as well. And that's different than the stages. So I found this article by William Smith. The article is called The Psychology of Grief, the 4 Stages Explained. So when we're thinking about symptoms, we could really just break them down into physical, cognitive, emotional, and interpersonal symptoms. So as you're going through the 5 stages of grief, or whichever one you might be in, you might be experiencing symptoms differently. Like physical symptoms might be a loss of appetite. You might have a headache. You might feel fatigue. You might be having trouble sleeping. It might be really impacting your immune system. So that's why it's really important to probably look at the physical symptoms and say, hey, like this grief is impacting me more than, or it's impacting me more than one way. Cognitive symptoms, it can really mess up the way that you're thinking about things. The article really ties into a grieving individual might feel a sense of disassociation and distance from reality. So it's like, you're just not in the moment. You're not on your A game. It's really impacting like how you're raising your kids. It's going to impact how you're forming relationships. That might be more of interpersonal, but let's jump into that one next. So the way that it sort of looks at interpersonal skills is more with being socially withdrawn. Like you're just not connecting with the people that you used to connect with. And that can be difficult because I know like when I'm going through grief, it's kind of like the last thing that I want is for someone to say, are you okay? Like, do you want to talk about it? It's like, no, I really don't want to talk about it. And I think people are just trying to be polite, but it's still like maybe not the best thing to say. And I get asked this a lot when someone's going through a hard time, like, what do you say? The secret is you don't need to say anything. You just need to be in the room with them, kind of, sharing in that space. And if that person starts to talk, then you can kind of jump in. But other than that, just be with them. Emotional symptoms are something that people should also be aware of. And this is, one of the favorite things I have in my office is this feeling wheel. There's so many feelings that you go through. It's hard to keep track of all of them. But the spectrum of possible emotions, again, can be diverse. You can be depressed, guilty, angry, hostility, anxiety, despair, hopelessness. So, and sometimes they can be all occurring at the same time. So it's really good to kind of be aware of how the emotional symptoms of grief are impacting your overall daily life. And then the last one, it gets into our lifestyle symptoms, which I think is kind of interesting. If you've ever watched the show Hoarders, I'd say maybe 50%, maybe even more, of the cases on that show, when they get to the root of what the person is going through, it's typically prolonged grief. Whether they've lost their mother or their spouse, and they just can't seem to move past getting rid of their things or even, organizing their lifestyle to live without them. I know after losing a couple of uncles in the past, it was kind of hard to watch, but also kind of inspiring too, to watch my aunts kind of overcome that and to find, I don't want to say a newfound life, but just that they were able to grieve and to kind of get past that. And it was kind of inspiring to see their whole lifestyles change. They would either switch jobs or, meet new people. They never remarried. But they just were able to kind of reform or form a new social life after their spouse had passed away. I know that anger is one of the stages of grief, but it may surprise people to look at anger in a different way. So what the article says is that anger is essentially our brain protesting against something we are experiencing that is perceived as unjust and frustrating. So it's not the same angry that you would experience if you didn't get what you wanted or someone else made you angry. Like, you're not necessarily angry that the person has passed away. What you're angry at is that it's unjust and it's not fair, and that you're now having to live without that person. I think anger also could be expressed because you're having to deal with really uncomfortable emotions that you might not like dealing with. I mean, who wants to feel guilty or hopeless? Who wants to feel isolated? Who would want to have to start their whole sort of daily routine over? I mean, I could definitely see that being, not that great or causing someone to feel angry. The book that all psychologists and mental health professionals use is called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM. And they just came out with a DSM-5 TR, and the TR stands for text revisions. So this is like the holy grail book that all therapists use to diagnose mental health disorders. Primarily, I'd say it's used for insurance reimbursements, but it is a very, very helpful tool for helping therapists differentiate between different mental health disorders. Like, there's a whole chapter on mood disorders. There's one on depression. So anyway, I forgot about this, but I think it was 2022, so this would be last year, they came out with a new disorder in the book called a prolonged grief disorder. And if you think about it, like, a prolonged grief disorder kind of makes sense because it's characterized by these intense and persistent grief that causes problems and interferes with daily life. Grief is kind of two-folded to where we have to go through it. It's not easy. We're going to go through really difficult emotions, and it's not going to necessarily be something enjoyable to go through. But on the same sense, it's kind of part of our natural lives. So we all are going to have to go through grief, and it should decrease over time. It doesn't mean that it still doesn't hurt or that you still think about grief, but that you're able to hopefully cope with it better and it's not interfering with your daily life. So like, that's something that I always talk to my clients about is, is your anxiety impacting your daily life? And then typically they're going to say yes, but to what degree is it impacting your daily life? So that's kind of a good gauge for people when they're contemplating or considering getting diagnosed or dealing with mental health, is to look at the broader sense of how is this issue or how are these symptoms impacting my daily life? So the DSM here says for a diagnosis of prolonged grief disorder, the loss of a loved one had to have occurred at least a year ago for adults and at least 6 months ago for children and adolescents. So again, what the DSM tries to do is to put things into time frames for people. So, are you depressed every day? Are you depressed every month? Have you been depressed for longer than 2 years? So like, that's how we sort of differentiate between like major depressive disorder. There's persistent depressive disorder. There's a few other ones too, but so for the prolonged grief disorder, in addition, the grieving individual must have experienced at least 3 of the symptoms below nearly every day for at least the last month prior to the diagnosis. So as a therapist, when I'm assessing someone, I'm going to be looking at these symptoms and asking the client, have you experienced these? And then 2, they have to be nearly every day for at least the last month. The symptoms are identity disruption. So that would be such as feeling as though part of oneself has died. Another one is a marked sense of disbelief about the death, avoidance of reminders that the person is dead, intense emotional pain such as anger, bitterness, sorrow related to the death, difficulty with reintegration. So meaning that you're now having problems engaging with your friends, pursuing interest, or planning for your future. Emotional numbness, the absence or marked reduction of emotional experience. 2 more here. We have feeling that life is meaningless or intense loneliness. So feeling alone or detached from others. And again, these symptoms are subjective, they're perceptive. So in the sense that you might feel lonely, that's not the same thing as feeling intense loneliness for at least a month every single day. And then also remember, you have to have been experiencing these as an adult for a full year. And for children, it's at least 6 months. It says here, in addition, the person's bereavement lasts longer than might be expected based on social, cultural, or religious norms. And I think the DSM does a pretty good job of doing this. I think there's a lot more room for improvement, but they're starting to look at cultural norms and religious norms and social norms related to the criteria for these disorders. Something else kind of interesting is that it says prolonged grief disorder often occurs along with other mental disorders, such as PTSD, anxiety, or depression. The most common one, however, is sleep problems. It says an estimated 80% of people with prolonged grief disorder experience long-term poor sleep habits. So I would say that most people are familiar with the stages of grief. If you're not, then this podcast will be perfect for you. It's something that you're just going to go through. If you haven't yet, you definitely will. So a little background about the stages of grief. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross wrote this book in 1969 titled On Death and Dying. And what she did was that she applied these stages of grief to people suffering from terminal illness. I think when we talk about grief, the word bereavement comes up, and that's actually something different. So bereavement is when you're grieving or you're going through the loss of a person, whereas grief is actually something different. Her first 5 or the 5 stages would be denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And the cool thing that I think about the stages of grief is that they don't go in order. You could potentially be experiencing 2 of the stages at the same time. So I think on this podcast, we're going to kind of break these down and just kind of explore what they might mean. The interesting thing, though, that I found when I was doing this research, and I'm still in shock by it, it's very surprising, but the fact is that no study has ever established that the stages of grief actually exist. So in other words, there's been no study to say that they are empirically true. And I just find that fascinating because, we've been talking about the stages of grief for forever. But even then, when Elizabeth Kubler-Ross wrote this book, it was in 1969. So we're looking at maybe a little over 50 years. So they're still very, very new. And when I think of grief, you certainly grieve over the loss of a person, but you're going to go through other stages in your life that you're going to experience grief, whether it be, the loss of a pet, loss of a job, the loss of your own identity, perhaps. So the stages of grief, I think, are important on many different levels. Let's probably just start with denial and what that kind of looks like. You could say you're in denial in a variety of different ways. Probably the most obvious one is that you don't even actually realize that you're in the denial stage. You're going to say things like, I'm fine. This actually isn't impacting me. It doesn't bother me. This can't happen to me. So denial is usually only just a temporary defense and generally feels where this feeling is generally replaced with heightened awareness of situations and individuals that will be left behind after death. If you're mourning the loss of your parents, you just can't believe that they're not going to be there at the next Christmas or your next birthday, or you're not going to have those future experiences. I remember this professor I had in my undergrad. He was just a sweet, sweet guy. And he actually wrote a short book on grief. And at the end of the quarter, he gave the copy to each of the students. And he talked about the loss of his wife, actually. I believe it was to suicide, if I remember. But what was so profound about his story was that after she died,
every morning he still made a second cup of coffee and would make it exactly how she would drink it. And I just thought, wow, man, like, imagine waking up every day still living in that stage of denial, but yet kind of being okay with it, or sort of, working through that therapy. So I wouldn't say that denial is a bad stage to be in. It's just realizing the legacy that that person left behind, or again, looking at it in a different way. If you're not coming to terms with your adulthood, right? And you're thinking about like what it was like to be a kid again, that's sort of the same thing of being in a stage of denial. Another stage of grief is anger. And that one is not, it doesn't mean that you're technically having the emotional reaction like an anger where you're either being aggressive or whatever. It's more of like, this can't be happening to me right now. It's kind of similar to denial, but it's the way that you express it comes off as you're being angry about something. And that can be very, very healthy also. I mean, if something was taken away from you or you weren't ready for that to happen, it's okay to be angry about it. When I work with kids, it's always kind of comical that the adults want them to not be angry. And it's like, no, I don't know how to really do that. I can help them how to channel their anger or how to express their anger appropriately. But being angry is not the problem. This stage can be particularly difficult when the loss is unpredictable or if it was blindsided. So really what anger comes down to is having control. And when we're dealing with death or with grief, it's out of your control. So that's kind of what it looks like, is that it's not necessarily anger, as it's really just a loss of control. And that you realize, there's something bigger to the world than just you. Another way to say that would be anger is avoiding the feeling of helplessness. Because again, you're not going to have control over these stages or when you go through them. Another stage would be the bargaining stage. And this is kind of interesting because people can actually bargain in a couple of different ways. You can be bargaining in the present. So it's where people might try to make a deal with themselves or with a higher power, for those who are spiritual or religious even, under the condition that if they act in a particular way, that they may feel better or that the situation may improve. So you're sort of bargaining with yourself that, if I go visit the gravesite, it's going to bring them back. Or if I do these good deeds, it's going to alleviate some of this pain that I'm going through. The other bargaining way would be bargaining over the past. So that would probably be more of the example I gave about going to the gravesite. It's where people will ruminate, which ruminate in a psychology term means that you're just thinking and thinking and thinking and thinking about the same things. It's what cows do to grass. They ruminate on grass, but humans do this with their thoughts. So you sort of run this over in your head, what if I had been there? What if I had done this? What if I had, fulfilled that thing? Then I wouldn't be in this situation. And honestly, that's just not true. You don't have control over the stages of grief. You have to just experience them. Other feelings that you might feel when going through the bargaining stage is guilt, or just being ashamed of your thoughts or your actions. Again, like you're having to feel through these stages of grief, and that can be extremely uncomfortable, and things are just going to kind of be overwhelming to you, and you're not even going to know why. You might be feeling scared, insecure, anxious, holding yourself responsible for the circumstances, which again, that's not a good place to be in, because you more than likely don't have control over it. You're going to try to punish yourself, worrying and overthinking things. Again, you're saying things like, what if, or if I had, or if I do this, then. Those are all clear indications that you're in the bargaining stage. And then there's the depression stage. And I feel like that's really hard for people because they probably assume it's more of like the clinical depression, but I just see it differently. You're sad, and you have every reason to be sad. You're mourning the loss of something. That's where that word mourning comes from. And again, it's not the same as clinical depression. It's more of, I would describe it as like a heavy sadness, perhaps even like a desire to be isolated. It's that feeling of hopelessness. These are those tough emotions that sometimes we have to go through, and it's okay to go through those. Again, for me, sometimes
I'd rather not talk about it. I'd rather just kind of sit in it and reflect. You probably wonder, will the sadness ever go away? And I guess the best way that I would describe it is that it probably never goes away. You're just able to tolerate it more and to get to the next stage. Sometimes it's like, how hard is it to think about anything else than what you're experiencing? And that's what I mean by sitting in the sadness. I know for creative people, I wouldn't say it's welcomed, but it's not necessarily a bad place to be in, because there is beauty in sadness and being depressed in the sense of the stages of grief. Okay, this is different than what clinical depression is. It's, like on major holidays where we mourn the loss of other people, or on Mother's Day or Father's Day. It's for those people that have lost their mothers and their fathers, I would almost guarantee that they're sad, but they're not necessarily depressed. It's more of like a state of mourning and a state of kind of sitting in it. And again, the depression stage is really an important part to getting to the acceptance stage. I feel like acceptance is hard to understand in the sense that, like, imagine there are people that think, well, if I accept this loss or I accept this grief, that I'm letting it go. And that's not really the way that I see it. I think the acceptance stage is really about looking at it from all of the other stages and then getting to a point where you can accept it and honor it and remember it and move on from it, but also use it perhaps as like a source of strength for you. I mean, I just recently lost my dog after 18 years, and I'm definitely going through those stages of grief. And like one of the things I had made was a little keychain with his ashes in it. So I'm constantly being reminded and thinking about his passing, but at the same time, I don't necessarily feel like I'm sad all the time when I look at the keychain or sort of think about him. It sort of is a way of honoring his legacy and reminding me of all of the good times and his life. So I think acceptance is more about remembering and getting to a point where you can use the stages of grief as a way to honor someone or something or some experience and use that to move forward. If you get a chance and you're in the Port Clinton, Ohio area, stop by the Yellow House Bakery, located on Madison Street in Port Clinton, Ohio. The Yellow House Bakery is passionate about a few things: simplicity, accessibility, community, family well-being, and, of course, baked goods. They aim to connect by creating good-for-the-soul baked goods using only high-quality, simple ingredients. And each month, they also offer a new, unique baked good. And trust me, they sell out quickly, so make sure you get there early.
Hold each other close, walking in the rain. You were like a picture and not a frame. You were like the air and not a plane.
By the way, at The Wellness Project, we have merchandise. That's right, all mental health awareness themed products. We've got artwork, we've got shirts, we've got hats, we've got candles. We're gonna have one for like anxiety awareness, depression awareness, wellness awareness, which is actually out right now. That's right, you can get your own wellness awareness candle. What does it smell like, right? You have to come in and check it out. But if you hit me up on Facebook, or you can email me and I can give you that information. And thank you for your support.
There's a million places I could go, but so you